It is my distinct honor to introduce our next speaker. Gard Jameson has been a friend to not only the Urantiathons, he has participated in all 4 now of the English-focused Urantiathons, but also to the entire Urantia community and the education efforts for Urantia community for many, many years. He's been reading the Urantia book since 1972, and he's been leading a study group in Las Vegas, which is now a Zoom group, since 1985. He currently serves as a trustee at Urantia Foundation and is the head of the education committee for Urantia Foundation. He's married to Dr. Florence Jameson and has 2 daughters, Julia and MJ. Gard Jameson, take it away.
Chris, thank you so much. And good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you might be, to my friends out there on this beautiful blue planet. It's a beautiful day here in southern Nevada, blue skies. I'm looking out over Lake Mead and recognizing the glory of God's creation. So I hope you are experiencing something of a similar nature where you are. And what I would like to do is to open with a moment of silence. So if you would be so kind as to just get comfortable wherever you are and take a few deep breaths, breathing into your nose and slowly breathing out. Notice any tension in your body. Allow yourself to breathe through that. And I'm going to ring my bell here, and we will take 3 minutes of silent worship, silent meditation to be present to the presence of the divine indwelling within each of us. Thank you, my friends, for taking that moment. In my short 67 years here on planet Urantia, I've learned that silence is God's primary language. And I'm still taking classes in it. It's not an easy language. But when we listen deeply into that silence, we begin to experience the presence and action of God's incredible presence within each of us. Presence of the Spirit of Truth, the Holy Spirit, and how those presences are working to, one, heal us of all that keeps us from the intimate relationship we have with God, and 2, to transform us. We learn in the Urantia book that worship makes one increasingly like the being who is worshipped. So when Chris shared with me the topic for this Urantiathon, I was overjoyed, I would say. So faith, joy, and peace. I was overjoyed. And here we have an image of our master done by a fellow in Utah who's a friend of the Urantia movement, Greg Olson, of Jesus in joy. And what we recognize with Jesus is that as difficult as his life was, and it was difficult, losing a father, experiencing something of the rejection of a family who didn't quite understand him, experiencing the ups and downs of dealing with his apostles who were grappling with, what is this gospel? Who is this person? And then having to deal with the authorities in Jerusalem and how they came down so hard upon him. What we see throughout is that this incredible person, our Creator's Son, as you've heard, I'm sure, many times before this presentation, was a person of gladness. He was a person of joy. And he carried that joy even to the night before he was crucified on the cross. he prayed, you may recall, he prayed that his apostles, his disciples, his followers might experience the joy that he himself experienced. And so, in a very kind of strange way, even through the experience of the cross, there is this quality of joy which manifests itself in this person of Jesus. So I'm going to carry us through. So here's a really smart person. I really like listening to smart people. And when Albert Einstein says something like this, I pay close attention. So he said, as you see, the most important question is the universe a friendly place? Now, I would have thought, I don't know, that maybe there were other questions in this great physicist's mind that were the most important question. But I think we all can relate to this question. And I encourage you to use this as an opener when you're talking to people, because people oftentimes in my classes, the students don't know what Albert Einstein's most important question was. Do we live in a friendly universe? And so we have been privileged through the context of the Urantia revelation to know that in fact we do. But I will share with you, I teach at the University of Nevada, that most of my students don't believe this. They don't trust the universe. They feel lost in space. And so you see there on the screen, maybe you see it, the astronaut who's kind of there way out from the space station. And so this is what our incredible message is that we do live in a friendly universe and that we can trust the universe. There are not only physical laws, but there are spiritual laws, which again, if you go up against the law of gravity, as we say, whether this jar hits the stone or the stone hits the jar, it's bad for the jar. These laws are consistent and they are eternal. They constitute the very fabric of our universe. And so how blessed are we that we live in a lawful and ordered universe. And so I teach Asian philosophy, Indian and Chinese philosophy. And in India, there's a wonderful image. This is something you may be familiar, the image of Shiva. And Shiva is dancing. And what I tell my students in Indian philosophy is that this is a symbol. And it's a symbol which basically proclaims that we live in a friendly universe. And that, if you will, there's a quality of joy inherent in our existence. I like to use phrases from the Urantia book when I teach, as I know my brother Jeff, who's somewhere on the line, likes to as well. And you see Shiva is dancing, and sometimes the question is asked, there looks like there's a little kid under Shiva's foot. And in fact, it is symbolically the symbol of ignorance, or avidya, a lack of vision, that Shiva is dancing on. And that's why Shiva is so blissful, is that ignorance is in some fashion being eliminated. You see the hand gestures to the left of your screen, and one is a symbol of protection. The other is a symbol of spiritual liberation, that we are all born, we are all spiritual beings having a human experience, and that we're born to this quality of liberation, this quality of joy and peace that we're talking about this afternoon. And you see also in one hand a drum. It's kind of hard to make out the drum, but it's the drum of creation, that we're part of a cycle. And to the right is the fire, symbol of fire, which is fire of renewal, that we're constantly going through what we call a genesis, a cosmogenesis, where we're constantly being renewed to the extent that we open our hearts and our minds to the divine energies pouring through each of us, through our minds and our hearts. And so this symbol represents, if you will, a very clear communication that we live in a friendly universe according to the culture of India. And then we're told in the Urantia book that it is a fact that Urantia has become known by the neighboring planets as the world of the cross. The world of the cross. It's very interesting. And the question I have for all of you is, as participants, as inhabitants on the world of the cross, can we see in the cross actually a symbol signifying that we live in a friendly universe? So oftentimes we have some kind of reaction to the cross, which is a reaction of horror. But to the universe around us, that cross stands for so much more. And so I want you to think about that for a moment, is how does the cross actually signify that we live in a friendly universe? And if anybody would like to raise their hand, and maybe just a couple of people, and say how it is that the cross is a symbol signifying that we live in a friendly universe, feel free to raise your hand. And Antonio, if you could acknowledge.
Yes, we have somebody called Moacir Budal da Costa.
Hello, brother. How are you?
Hi, Gard. It's good to see you. I'm glad you're doing this. My thinking is that Jesus's attitude on the cross was one of love. He was loving toward his tormentors. He was loving and ministerial to the two prisoners with him. So I definitely see that if this is God dying a torturous death, and yet he continues to love, under those circumstances, God is friendly.
There you go. There you go. It's an image of unconditional love, isn't it, Richard? God's unconditional love for us, that he would be willing not only to die for his friends, but to die for his enemies. Huh? And again, as egregious and as difficult as that image is for us, and when it comes around to Easter season, I often, when I see that image and I read the last week, which I encourage everybody to do during the Easter season, read each day, it brings me to tears. But it's tears not only of sadness and of sorrow, but of joy that we serve such a God, that quality of unconditional love extends itself even to something as horrible as the experience of the cross. So Richard, thank you for that. I often ask my students, every moment is an option, right? We exist in a moment where there is a choice between two doors. And I say that this class that I'm about to teach you, whether it's Chinese or Indian or the history of philosophy, is really an expression of that choice. And that during our semester, I'm going to give you some tools by which you can begin to migrate from door number 1 on the left to door number 2 on the right, which is love, joy, and peace. And really the critical factor here is, what is the attitude? That's the choice. What is the attitude that we carry as we move forward through this experience of life here on this planet, sometimes difficult planet? And with that choice of attitude comes the key to opening up door number 2 on the right, the experience of love, joy, and peace. So one of my dear friends who recently passed, who was a friend to some of you, is Richard Keeler, who was a trustee and in my mind, one of the heroes of our Urantia community. This was his favorite quote. And Chris, can you read this?
Certitude in the divine. Of God, the most inescapable of all presences, the most real of all facts, the most living of all truths, the most loving of all friends, and the most divine of all values. We have the right to be the most certain of all universe experiences.
Wow. I want to say that that's one you can take to the bank. That is an incredible statement, which as an undergraduate, Jeff and I shared the same institution as undergraduates. I was always scratching my head. Could one really prove the existence of God? But as many of us, I was a fool looking for proof outside of me and not realizing it was inside of me. And here we have, I think, a very clear articulation that we can prove beyond any shadow of a doubt the presence of that divine reality that indwells each of us. That is an incredible revelation. Oh, by the way, did I say we're all reading a revelation? That's pretty exciting. So here, again, we ask the first word of the marquee of our presentation today, faith. What is faith? Faith in who or what? When do you know faith is working, right? Some questions for us to ask. What is faith? Faith in who or what? When do you know it's working? So there was a study done by Baylor University, I think a really powerful study, 5,000 people who had identified as Christian. And what they found was that the vast majority of these individuals saw God as authoritative, distant, and critical, right? Authoritative, distant, and critical. Now, there was a smaller percentage, about 23%, who saw God as benevolent. But even that group, the 23%, said that God is benevolent, but sometimes God really gets angry. So what you should know when you're talking to people is that most people who are coming from, if you will, the Christian tradition, and I would say the Jewish tradition and the Muslim tradition as well, have something of this image in their minds as they think about God. So again, just imagine, I think we all on the screen know that the Urantia revelation suggests, no, not authoritarian. Yeah, well, in a certain way, distant, but also present in your very personality. And critical? I don't think so. I don't think so. And benevolent sometimes gets angry? Well, yeah, we'll go with the benevolent, but never gets angry. So again, most people are carrying a very difficult image of God. And what we can say, and maybe for some of us, even with the Urantia revelation, you may still have a sense that God is distant. You may still have some of this inside of you. And part of the spiritual journey, part of the faith journey, is to clear out that garbage and to bring in the correct image of God. So what we can say emphatically is our images of God shape us. So it's a good idea to check our images of God and to ask ourselves, what image of God, even if you've been reading the Urantia book for a long time, you may still think God is out there and really, I'm not so sure about being in here. And this is the image that most people, when they talk about God, have. God of a conditional love, a God who has a if-then. If you do this, if you believe this, then I may reward you. But it depends on how I slept last night. And again, these kinds of images lead to a quality of not just inner violence, but outer violence. And we've seen that through the history of these traditions, how these images of God not only shape us, but also shape our behavior. So what I think the Urantia revelation, if it's doing anything, it's come to really give us that new and wondrous image of God, as Richard said earlier, of an unconditional source of love. And so that's our option, is to buy into that image of God as unconditional love. I actually was a volunteer pastor at my church for a number of years. The prior pastor had passed away, and so they asked me to step up. So I was a volunteer, and there was a group of evangelicals there, and I got thrown out of the church because I dared to say that God's love is unconditional. And so I was actually quite proud of the fact that they threw me out on that condition. So 3 times in the Urantia book, we get this definition, and you've probably seen this again earlier in the presentations that have been given. But when the Urantia book repeats itself 3 times, I think it's a good idea to pay attention. So religion is faith trust, and assurance. Faith, trust, and assurance. So we're going to unpack that just a little bit in our time this afternoon. Faith, trust, and assurance. I want you to keep all those in mind. In fact, I like acronyms. I don't know how you all are, but my memory, right? 67. Sometimes I forget. I don't know, how is it with you, Richard? You ever forget anything? Probably not. You're a pretty sharp guy. But I sometimes use acronyms. So I use actually the acronym, and maybe there's a better one, FAT, FAT, to remember this one. FAT with faith. So here's a question for you, and anybody wants to raise their hand. What is the distinction between faith and trust? We're going to talk later about assurance, but faith and trust, I sometimes used to think that those two things were the same thing. But the Urantia book makes it very clear: faith, trust, and assurance. So anybody want to raise their hand on that? What is the distinction between faith and trust? Chris, I see your hand moving around. Are you looking at your hand?
I'm looking at the other people because I speak so much. I thought we'd let other people go.
Okay, yeah. Has anybody else got their...
Not yet.
Do you see anybody's hand raised or anybody's... I can't see much from where I'm sitting.
No, no hands raised yet.
Oh, okay. How
Oh,
about my
there's
brother?
somebody. There's Anna Michael Krista.
Michael, go
Anna.
ahead.
Yes, you're free to speak. You have to unmute yourself, Anna. Okay.
Ah, Stuart.
Stuart, yes.
Yes, thank you, Gard. The key thing is, again, faith and trust. What I find interesting is how the revelators upgrade the English language from the 1930s to a higher language of the local universe, higher concepts. And they often they redefine the English language, terms such as faith and trust. But then they add sometimes new concepts. And I think there's three times, they use the term faith dash trust.
Yes, yes.
Faith, trust.
Yeah.
What does that mean? It means to me a process. Faith is the leap of faith we take. But we don't have the assurance. We're living on the hope of our faith, as small as a mustard seed. But when we trust, we take it now as an account of the truth of reality between us and the Father. And now we no longer just have faith in his existence and his goodness. We have experience of it in relationship. And the process leads to a foundation of trust. Now this security, peace, and tranquility of knowing that God is truly for us and that no matter what happens, we are in good care and love.
Yeah, Stuart, I always knew you were a Urantia companion, but now you've verified it for me. Thank you very much, Stuart. Andre.
Thanks for the question, because it's very interesting to go through the process of trying to make the distinction, because it can, like you say, appear to be a distinction without a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate what Stuart said as well, because what it's underscored for me is that for years and years, faith has had a down and dirty definition for me as acting as if. And what it's meant is acting as if what you believe is true.
Mm-hmm.
So if I really do have faith in God, I act as though God is real. And if I believe God is benevolent, as you're suggesting, then I act that way. Well, there's other aspects, and of course, I always feel like I'm coming back home with you, Gard, because in 1993, you led a session that was teaching centering prayer, as you've done in so many ways. And that's where I changed from transcendental meditation to centering prayer. And here's how I would make the distinction between faith and trust. Faith told me, you know, I should take up the practice. I should go ahead and do this practice. What trust does, and this distinction just came to me, trust tells me, let go of results. Let go of what you think ought to be happening.
Mm-hmm.
And trust that the process works. Trust that coming to God works. It's so, to me, faith is the front end. In one paradigm, faith is the front end, and trust is the back end of this process.
Well said, Andre. Very beautifully said. Yeah, sometimes, you know, as you just shared, we talk about faith as assuming the truth and acting upon that assumption. And trust, with the dash, means really leaning into it, really leaning into that position, surrendering yourself to that position. So again, and as you know from centering prayer and worship and divine meditation, sometimes we get distracted by the thoughts. Are we really leaning into the assumption when we spend our 20 minutes with those thoughts? Maybe, maybe not. But I think the trust piece is really so critical, as you and Stuart have pointed out, because it really is leaning into that assumption. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Stuart. So what we learned from paper 140 is that there are 4 inner dimensions of faith. The inward path, which is a quality of humility, which is, I always like to say, the first button on the shirt. And that is truly something we need to lean into, because we are not, well, maybe we're born humble. I probably 2 different schools of thought on that one, but as we get older, our humility perhaps becomes less. And then, blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness. What is the quality of hunger that we have in ourselves around the questions of truth and beauty and goodness? Then blessed are the meek, which means blessed are those who weary not in well-doing, who carry on, if you will, the good fight of faith, and who move through the difficulties and obstacles of this short existence here on this planet. And then blessed are the pure in heart, or the purity of our intention really defines our path. And so those are the inward pieces. I say it's faith looking inward at God. And then the outward path is, blessed are you when you mourn. Do we have a heart and a mind that's open to the difficulty around us, especially during this time of pandemic, which is not just a physical pandemic, but it's a moral and it's a spiritual pandemic, where we see increasing isolation and we see the qualities of social injustice, which are all around us as evidence of our inability to respect diversity, equality, and not to see the inequities that are going on around us. They've become so clear. So can we mourn what we are seeing out there? Can we actually experience a quality of tenderness and difficulty? And then that leads to compassion. And compassion, in my opinion, does not exist without that quality of mourning. And I think Jesus makes this clear in these 4 responses to faith, that a quality of mourning leads to a quality of compassion, because compassion means suffering with, and we can't suffer with unless we mourn. But compassion is not just suffering with mentally, it's a motivation. It's a core motivation to action, which leads to the third, which is blessed are the peacemakers. So what is the quality of service that we're engaged with in the world around us, recognizing that the world around us doesn't really necessarily understand this new platform of behavior, of faith in the world, And it's going to push back sometimes. When we opened our free clinic here in Southern Nevada, we had so many residents who said, not in my backyard, you know, you're going to bring all the ne'er-do-wells. Well, it hasn't happened. We've been open for 10 years now. And but you're going to get persecuted when you try to do these things. So as the good Congressman John Lewis said, it's up to us to go out there and create a little good trouble. And so again, a deep quality of emptiness and recognizing our emptiness. This should be easy for Urantians. As we say, we're at the bottom of the ladder, right? And there's a lot of confusion. I love the first line of the Urantia book, in the minds of mortals there is great confusion. And so there should be a quality of emptiness, of humility as we think about these matters. So how humble are we? And Andre alluded to this. Are you willing to make a divine appointment? Are you willing to lean in with trust to your relationship with God? And I like to say a divine appointment is if God's knocking at the door and you see Jesus knocking at the door there, are you willing to say, yeah, come on in, let's spend some time together? I ask each of you to ask yourself the question, are you willing to take 15 or 20 minutes in the morning and then, imagine this, 15 or 20 minutes in the evening to make a divine appointment with our very best friend, the most loving of all presences? Are we willing to do that? It's a big question. And I think it's an important one, especially here on the planet, especially if we want to, in some fashion, engage the assurance of faith, which is joy and peace. So my teacher, Thomas Keating, has a very interesting line, which some of you may recognize from the Urantia book, but he didn't get it from the Urantia book. He says, dedication to God, knowing God, is developed by a commitment to one's spiritual practice. So what is your spiritual practice? Service to others is the outward movement of the heart prompted by compassion. Centering prayer, which I would call, and I think Andre has the same experience, and many of you on the screen perhaps do as well, worship is being present to God's, consenting to God's presence and action within us, is the inward illumination of the soul. Together, service and contemplative practice bring us to friendship with God and love of creation. Now, I think many of you on the screen may recall the line from the Urantia book, we are inwardly illuminated by worship, and we are outwardly dedicated to the wholehearted service of humanity, right? This is the sort of two strokes of faith. Are we inwardly illuminated by worship? When that illumination comes, simultaneously comes joy and peace and, we might add, unconditional love. How about that? These are the treasures that are spoken of in the Beatitudes. And then our hunger and thirst for truth and righteousness. What is the quality of our spiritual appetite? What is the quality of your spiritual appetite? By virtue of the fact you're here, it strikes me that it's reasonably good. But are you willing to share your inner life with God? Have you developed and sharpened your spiritual habits? What is your worship and service habit? Right? What is your worship and service habit? So one of the great students of the Urantia Revelation was Sir Hubert Wilkins. For some of you, this is a name you've heard before. If you've not read his biography, I encourage you to read it. In fact, you can go onto YouTube and you can see a clip of Sir Hubert Wilkins, and it's very fun because it's with Groucho Marx. Some of us are old enough, Stuart, you may recall, You Bet Your Life, right? And so Sir Hubert Wilkins was on that show, and again, he's an incredible person, but he's a person who is a great explorer. In submarines, he went under the Arctic North, and in airplanes, he went over Antarctica, and he was one of the great explorers of the 20s, and he was friends with Dr. Sadler, and he learned of the Urantia Revelation, and he went to Chicago and he literally read the book in 2 weeks. He was a man of great energy and he read the whole book in 2 weeks. And I'm saying he read the book, he understood the book. In fact, when he died, there was a submarine that took his ashes to the South Pole, and he asked that his ashes and a book be placed together. And I just ask you to imagine what book that might have been. It was the Urantia book. An incredible person, but here again, what we say is that it requires a quality of courage to sort of step outside of our comfort zone and to invade, literally to invade, take the kingdom with force, with new levels of experience, and to attempt the exploration of unknown realms. So I use this image of Sir Hubert Wilkins as one of the great explorers of the outer world of unknown realms. But what I know, and I think all of you on the screen know, is that the greatest unknown realm is the unknown realm that dwells within each of us. This is the great field of exploration over the next, who knows how many hundreds of years, that we will begin to just get the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's going on in that inner world. What are the qualities of that inner world, and how does that inner world change? Neuroscience, as you may know, is now just beginning to unpack what happens when there's coherence in brainwave patterns, when there's coherence in heart patterns, and how that affects the release of hormones, and how that affects the balance within the systems of the body. It's absolutely a fascinating new world we're dwelling in. And so, blessed are the meek, again, a quality of patience and forbearance as we move through this life. These are all the elements that Jesus said that constitute what faith is. And then here, Nelson Mandela, purity in heart. He himself was a fairly violent revolutionary before he was put in prison on Robben Island. Marvin Garwin and some of us were in Cape Town, South Africa in 1999, and Nelson Mandela took us out to Robben Island on the boats. And there he shared his story of personal spiritual transformation and how he set his heart's intention upon a new kind of radicalism, which the Dalai Lama calls compassion, and led to the end of apartheid. So, as Andre pointed out and Stuart pointed out, it's fascinating how these two words have been connected by the Urantia revelation. And it gives us a new kind of dictionary, a new kind of understanding of both of these words. Let's see, Jeff, are you on the line? Can you read this one?
Want to read here?
Yeah, go ahead.
If you're talking to Jeff Taylor.
Yes, go ahead, Jeff.
The ideal of religious philosophy. Oh, I got an echo. I got to turn my other thing down here. Stand by.
That sounds like Susan's laugh.
The ideal of religious philosophy is such a faith trust as would lead men unqualifiedly to depend upon the absolute love of the infinite Father of the universe of universes.
Wow. So, Jeff, what do you think about that word, unqualifiedly? No reservations, right, Jeff? Leaning in with the fullness of our heart and mind. And so again, we get from our friends, the revelators, this incredible insight, right? How deep can we lean in? How low can we surrender ourselves? How humble can we become before this incredible presence of unconditional love that indwells us? That's the question, I think, before each of us. So,
God, there's a question, I think, from Marion Duke. She was raising her visible hand instead of...
Marion, how are you, my friend?
Hey, aloha, aloha, Gard. Long time.
Mahalo.
Well, actually, it was okay. I was going to interject one thing that we were talking about Sir Hubert Wilkins. So I'm a little back farther than you, but he was the first scientist to understand global warming and climate change.
Really? This I did not know. Thank you.
Yes, that's an excellent book. I love it. I've given it to people, and it's interesting how they do talk about the Urantia book in that book.
Okay.
One of his people on the submarine, or later on, saw him with that book. So yeah, I highly recommend it. Amazing. But I do think it was the North Pole they took his ashes. But
Was it the North Pole? I'd heard the South Pole.
I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was the North Pole, because he didn't get there in that submarine. Had he had a decent vessel, he might have. But that vessel was really a bad submarine. Anyway, I just wanted to interject that.
Beautiful.
And another thing I had about faith, that I've always questioned that word on a personal level, because as an Angandanter, we believe without seeing. We're told that that's one of the qualifications of an Angandanter. But to me, faith was you believe something that you can't see. But in my experience, I don't have to have faith in God because I've experienced God. So I'm not sure about that word. It's always confused me.
Yeah, it's a good point, Marian. In fact, in India, they call the great philosophers rishis, which means seers. And it's not that they see anything outside of themselves, they see it inside. So it's insight, right?
Right, right.
That
And that,
insight is more powerful than seeing outside. Yeah.
And my husband just found it is the North Pole that they scattered his ash. Just a moot point, but I thought I'd point that out. Anyway, thank you. I'm enjoying your presentation.
Yeah, do go to YouTube and see him there with Groucho Marx. It's quite fun.
I'll do that. Thank you.
So my wife and I, about 15 years ago, imagined a possibility of giving healthcare to people who have no access to healthcare. And so in our state, we had about 400,000 people who had absolutely no access to healthcare. And so we created Volunteers in Medicine in Southern Nevada, and we call it a culture of compassionate caring within a circle of trust. And so last year we saw about 8,000 people, and again, incredible stories of people who come in and literally their lives are on the line. And so we call it a circle of trust at Volunteers in Medicine, and that's the second piece of this journey. So what we use is actually our metric within the organization to evaluate our employees and how we're doing is the word trust. So teamwork, which you're all familiar with this, the most important lesson to be learned. Respect, you're all familiar with this quote, which was from the section on self-mastery. And this quote on unity, God is unity. And this quote on service, more service. And then transparency, which I also use the word authenticity or genuineness to define transparency. So again, faith, trust, and assurance, right? And so this acronym has been very helpful to us as we evaluate. In fact, at Urantia Foundation, these are the values by which we evaluate ourselves and our staff and the work that we're doing at Urantia Foundation. So we go to assurance from trust. And what we learn, right, and it's quoted in the Urantia book, Paul's quote from Romans, the kingdom of God is not meat and drink, but it's righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. So I don't know where Chris got the peace or the joy and peace, maybe from this passage. And again, this is the treasure. This is what we inherit. The meek shall inherit the earth. What is it that they're inheriting? They're inheriting a culture of love and joy and peace. And so I love this line by Catherine of Siena, that the journey to heaven is through heaven. In other words, in a certain real way, I think, because I think we all are carrying some level of ultimatonic reality within us, that heaven is here now, on a physical level and on a spiritual level. So this is where the assurance begins to kick in. And again, part of what Terre de Chardin and others, Wayne Teasdale, have said is that joy is the infallible sign of divine presence. So one of the ways I sort of take my pulse is, how's the joy factor today? Even with difficulty, and there's a lot of difficulty for all of us, physical disease, sometimes a depression. But as Rumi says, with all those things, welcome them in, right? His poem, The Guest House, they're all messengers and they all have something to speak to us. So the next piece here is that there is this movement from faith to trust, and from trust to assurance. And there's just a few passages in the book now, 67 years. I've been with the book for, I'd say, 50 some years, near 50 years. And some of these passages really ring quite powerfully to me. And this one in particular, the worship of God and the service of man, the sum and substance of Jesus' religion. Again, inwardly illuminated. And we can ask each of ourselves, how inwardly illuminated are we? Are we at 25 watts, 50 watts, 100 watts, 1,000 watts? How much illumination is going there? And you can kind of measure that by the quality of joy that you are experiencing in the present moment. And allied with that is the notion that we cannot really experience the fullness of that joy, the power of that joy, without a commitment to service. And that's not just service to the Urantia community, that's service to our families, service to our communities, and service in some fashion to the larger globe by virtue of the previous two levels of service. And I want to share with everybody before I get off here that in a couple of weeks on Valentine's Day, we're going to have another session. Chris is going to be part of it, along with Alice, on loving service. So I think Urantia Foundation's put that out, and hopefully you have seen that by now, or we'll see that shortly. So Jesus said, I desire that they should also be filled with the joy of the assurance of sonship in the heavenly kingdom. This is the result of faith. And this quality of peace, which Jesus promises to each of us, that the great and immediate service of truth is the establishment of an enduring unity in human experience and a lasting peace and a profound assurance. What I experience when I, in the morning and evening, do my worship time, is I experience that unity within. I experience a shift in consciousness. I experience that peace. I tell my students at the university, if you just experience a little bit of peace when I teach them meditation, put your hat on that. That's the ring, right? Put your hat on that one and follow that thread, because it's that peace which will grow larger and larger and larger over time if you are faithful to your practice. So we say there's a living ladder where we move in relationship, not just human, but divine, from being acquaintances to a quality of friendliness, to a quality of friendship, to a genuinely affectionate friendship, and then to divine union. And again, you can evaluate for yourself where on this ladder you are. Again, this is all very practical. As Francis Bacon says, if this stuff isn't practical, throw it in the trash can. But this is really the most practical wisdom that we could ever garner. And how are we moving through this? And I pray for each of you as we conclude here that you are moving through this ladder and that you are experiencing something of that friendliness or friendship, and that maybe some of you are even genuinely experiencing that deep, deep affection, which is a 24/7 sense of God's presence in your life. So this is my prayer for you. And as Jesus said, my peace I leave with you. And this is not just shalom. In Judaism, we say shalom, peace be with you. But Jesus is saying, my peace I leave with you. The peace of the Creator Son. And I think he speaks for the creative Mother Spirit as well. That their peace they leave with us. That is the promise of this journey. And that is the promise here and now. And to the extent that we can manifest those qualities of peace and joy and unconditional love, this world will shift. A friend of mine who's a rabbi in Holland says, we have just entered the Holy Decade. 2021 is the beginning of the Holy Decade. And I think many of us know that the angels of progress are knocking on the door right now, that there's going to be a turn, if you will, historically, very shortly, and that we are, if you will, the pioneers of this moment. So I encourage you to extend your time of worship, to find new avenues of service through family, through community, and even the larger whole, and be blessed and know the blessing of joy and faith and peace as you experience this incredible opportunity that we are experiencing here on this little planet, Urantia. So with that, I return controls to you, Antonio, my friend, and Chris.